Weird Audiobooks presents The Canal by Everil Worrell. Read by Wayne June. Past the sleeping city the river sweeps. Along its left bank the old canal creeps. I did not intend that to be poetry, although the scene is poetic. Somberly, gruesomely poetic, like the poems of Poe. Too well I know it. Too often have I walked over the grass-grown path, beside the reflections of black trees and tumble-down shacks and distant factory chimneys in the sluggish waters that moved so slowly, and ceased to move at all. I shall be called mad, and I shall be a suicide. I shall take no pains to cover up my trail, or to hide the thing that I shall do. What will it matter afterward what they say of me? If they knew the truth, if they could vision even dimly the beings with whom I have consorted, if the faintest realization might be theirs of the thing I am becoming and of the fate from which I am saving their city, then they would call me a great hero. But it does not matter what they call me, as I have said before. Let me write down the things I am about to write down, and let them be taken as they will be taken for the last ravings of a madman. The city will be in mourning for the thing I shall have done, but its mourning will be of no consequence beside that other fate from which I have saved it. I have always had a taste for nocturnal prowling. We as a race have grown too intelligent to take seriously any of the old instinctive fears that preserved us through preceding generations. Our sole remaining salvation, then, has come to be our tendency to travel in herds. We wander at night, but our objective is somewhere on the brightly lighted streets, or still somewhere where men do not go alone. When we travel far afield, it is in company. Few of my acquaintance, few in the whole city here, would care to ramble at midnight over the grass-grown path I have spoken of, not because they would fear to do so, but because such things are not being done. Well, it is dangerous to differ individually from one's fellows. It is dangerous to wander from the beaten road, and the fears that guarded the race in the dawn of time and through the centuries were real fears, founded on reality. A month ago, I was a stranger here. I had just taken my first position. I was graduated from college only 3 months before, in the spring. I was lonely, and likely to remain so for some time, for I've always been of a solitary nature, making friends slowly. I had received one invitation out to visit the camp of a fellow employee in the firm for which I worked, a camp which was located on the farther side of the wide river, the side across from the city and the canal, where the bank was high and steep and heavily wooded, and little tents blossomed all along the water's edge. At night these camps were a string of sparkling lights and tiny leaping campfires, and the tinkle of music carried faintly far across the calmly flowing water. That far bank of the river was no place for an eccentric, solitary man to love. But near the bank, which would have been an eyesore to the campers had not the river been so wide, the near bank attracted me from my first glimpse of it. We embarked in a motorboat at some distance downstream and swept up along the near bank, and then out and across the current. I turned my eyes backward. The murk of stagnant water that was the canal, the jumble of low buildings beyond it, the lonely, low-lying waste of the narrow strip of land between the canal and the river, the dark, scattered trees growing there. I intended to see more of these things. That weekend bored me, but I repaid myself no later than Monday evening, the first evening when I was back in the city, alone and free. I ate a solitary dinner immediately after leaving the office. I went to my room and slept from 7 until nearly midnight. I wakened naturally then, for my whole heart was set on exploring the alluring solitude I had discovered. I dressed, slipped out of the house and into the street, started the motor in my roadster, and drove through the lighted streets. I left behind that part of town which was thick with vehicles carrying people home from their evening engagements, and began to thread my way through the darker and narrower streets. Once I had to back out of a cul-de-sac, and once I had to detour around a closed block. This part of town was not alluring, even to me. It was dismal without being solitary. But when I had parked my car on a rough, cobbled street that ran directly down into the inky waters of the canal and crossed a narrow bridge, I was repaid. A few minutes set my feet on the old towpath where mules had drawn riverboats up and down only a year or so ago. Across the canal now, as I walked upstream at a swinging pace, the miserable shacks where miserable people lived seemed to march with me, and then fell behind. They looked like places in which murders might be committed, every one of them. The bridge I had crossed was near the end of the city, going north, as the canal marked its western extremity. 10 minutes of walking, and the dismal shacks were quite a distance behind. The river was farther away, and the strip of wasteland much wider and more wooded, and tall trees across the canal marched with me as the evil-looking houses had done before. Far and faint, the sound of a bell in the city reached my ears. It was midnight. I stopped, enjoying the desolation around me. It had the savor I had expected and hoped for. I stood for some time looking up at the sky, watching the low drift of heavy clouds which were visible in the dull reflected glow from the distant lights in the heart of the city, so that they appeared to have a lurid phosphorescence of their own. The ground under my feet, on the contrary, was utterly devoid of light. I had felt my way carefully, knowing the edge of the canal partly by instinct, partly by the even more perfect blackness of the water in it, and even holding fairly well to the path, because it was perceptibly sunken below the ground beside it. Now as I stood motionless in this spot, my eyes upcast, my mind adrift with strange fancies, suddenly my feelings of satisfaction and well-being gave way to something different. Fear was an emotion unknown to me, for those things which make men fear I had always loved. A graveyard at night was to me a charming place for a stroll and meditation. But now the roots of my hair seemed to move upright on my head, and along all the length of my spine I was conscious of a prickling, tingling sensation, such as my forefathers may have felt in the jungle when the hair on their backs stood up, as the hair of my head was doing now. Also, I was afraid to move, and I knew that there were eyes upon me, and that was why I was afraid to move. I was afraid of those eyes, afraid to see them, to look into them. All this while I stood perfectly still, my face up-tilted toward the sky. But after a terrible mental effort I mastered myself. Slowly, with an attempt to propitiate the owner of the unseen eyes by my casual manner, I lowered my own. I looked straight ahead, at the softly swaying silhouette of the treetops across the canal as they moved gently in the cool night wind, at the mass of blackness that was those trees, and the opposite shore, at the shiny blackness where the reflections of the clouds glinted vaguely and disappeared. That was the canal. And again I raised my eyes a little, for just across the canal, where the shadows massed most heavily, there was that at which I must look more closely. And now, as I grew accustomed to the greater blackness and my pupils expanded, I dimly discerned the contours of an old boat or barge half sunken in the water. An old abandoned canal boat. But was I dreaming? Or was there a white-clad figure seated on the roof of a low cabin aft, a pale, heart-shaped face gleaming strangely at me from the darkness, the glow of two eyes seeming to light up the face and to detach it from the darkness? Surely there could be no doubt as to the eyes. They shone as the eyes of animals shine in the dark, with a phosphorescent gleam and a glimmer of red.